Hello there, sword fans. Today I want to talk briefly about Dark Sword Armory grips and the evolution of those grips that I've seen over time. Now, I've had a number of Dark Sword Armory swords in my time, but I have two examples here, one from the somewhat distant past and one of their newest offerings, the Baron, which I did a kind of initial impressions video of some time ago. And since then, I've had some questions about the grips, and I've also heard some commentary about Dark Sword Armory grips and their improvements, and I thought it might be worthwhile just to compare and contrast them to some other swords that are available here. So here is the Baron. And it's nice. There's some perks, and I just kind of want to call them out as I see them. It has a nice kind of texture to it from the cord that's wound around the grip when the gluing happens. It's got a nice shape. It indexes well. It's not too big or too small. I happen to like it. The riser in the middle is a little, lackluster, I guess. It doesn't have as crisp a presence as I think perhaps it could. And as it goes down, you can see that the grip does have some taper. And as it meets the pommel, the transition on this particular end is not good. There's a slight ledge. It doesn't bite into my hand exactly, but I guess we'll see how bad or good it does when I actually get to using it. Anyway, I feel a slight ledge. I can kind of get a fingernail on it. I can kind of peel my fingernail a little bit on it. Up at the top, though, the transition is actually really good. It doesn't overlap or feel bad. I think transition's pretty good here. It's also worth noting that there's some kind of ripply surfaces here, like the grip, the core wasn't sanded particularly well, and it's just got some bumps and things like that. Now, on the whole, I think this is overall a good grip for the sword at this price point. This is a $500 to $700 sword. I can't exactly remember what, but that's a general ballpark that Dark Sword Armory seems to play in, and it comes with a scabbard and a blade and yada, yada, yada. But for that money, I think this grip is reasonably good. The thing I would say improvement-wise, transition down here could be better, and this little lip, it'd be nice if the lip on the seam of the leather where it's wound was a little bit tighter. I can feel it, and I do have some concerns that over time, maybe it'll come unglued, or it'll be a point where there'll be ugly aesthetic things that happen because there's a lip and you're constantly moving your hands around it. Anyway, those are the things, but otherwise, it's good. I like the shape. The bumps, they're not great. The precision around the riser could be better, but those things I think are less important to me than the transition here, number one, and the seam, number two. Otherwise, I think it's really a very solid grip. And I want to contrast that, forgive the audio here, with this right here. So this is an old DSA Fenor sword. It's got their older emblem on it right here. And there's been a huge amount of evolution that's happened in grips since this sword was made. Now, obviously, it's a different model sword. It's a fantasy type sword. It's got some thises and that's. But the point is that the grip, if I look at just the materials and general construction and how well this grip is made in contrast to the newer Baron, there's some things I can note. One, the leather. If I twist my hands on here, the leather feels soft. I mean, it's not bad leather, but it does feel like over time maybe it would loosen in contrast to the Baron, which feels much more sturdy. There's a seam that runs along the edge here, which is much more apparent. It's stitched, and that's just a different way of doing it, but it's certainly, I like the way that they're doing it now much more. It doesn't feel like a point of failure in the same way. This feels like it would fail quite a bit more. And over time, given that this one is old, you can kind of see where the previous owner has glued it or done some things. I can see where the core is showing a little bit on the edges. It's got some imperfections, certainly, in the grip, and just the shaping in general. Well, it doesn't have the same kind of ripply surface. It overlaps a little bit at this transition. It doesn't index well, particularly either. It feels a little bit more rounded. It's elliptical, but I certainly have more challenge. It's harder for me to kind of, just with my hand, feel right where the edge is in contrast to the newer Baron grip. It's a bit more bulbous. It turns to round relatively quickly. Same muddiness in the riser, and it turns around. It's also quite a bit larger, and I think in a way that some people might find uncomfortable. Transition to the pommel is okay, but obviously it's worn and not particularly great. The pommel, in this case, actually overlaps the grip versus the other way around it. And you can see that there's just been some kajiggering that's had to happen on this example to make it kind of stand the test of time. Anyway, the shaping, the materials, the attention to detail has grown quite a bit in the time that Dark Sword Armory has been making swords, and I think these two contrast each other well. There's no kind of linen-wrapped look to this sword. There's no texture to it. It's just wrapped over a wood core. I can spot where the wood core is. The leather feels loose by comparison. It's not loose, but like I can kind of move it around if I push on it in spots, and I certainly can't do that on the other one. So they've improved quite a bit on the grips, but is it perfect? Well, no, it's not. There's still some areas to improve. I've kind of pointed them out, but if I take into contrast some other offerings from different manufacturers. Now, this is a Valiant Armory sword. They don't make these anymore. They've moved and changed production, but I think the grips are probably pretty similar to what you might get today because they were making these in-house from what I understand when this one was made. Anyway, the point is that things may have changed around. This is not representative of Valiant Armory's work, but talking specifically about the grip. So what I see is some dimension, some shape. It rests and indexes well. There's no seam or transition, and I can make out all sorts of little patterns that seem pretty stable. But I can make out some spots where it's not glued perfectly, and there's some unsightly bits on here. But this sword now would cost quite a bit more than I believe the Dark Sword Armory would. It'd have a different blade and all that kind of stuff, and maybe it'd be assembled a little differently. But grip on this Valiant Armory sword, this one was I think $300 to $500 in its time with a scabbard, and it has a better grip, frankly, even than the Dark Sword Armory one does now. Just little attentions to detail, how it transitions here. This is not an ideal transition to me, but I would argue that it's certainly better than the way the Dark Sword Armory overlaps with metal and gives you something to potentially hurt your hand on. If I go with a even more expensive sword, this is an Albion Sempak. And it's a much more expensive sword. It's not fair to compare this. This Albion costs more with the blade by itself than the Dark Sword Armory does with the blade and the scabbard. But I can make out very clean lines running from the winded linen stuff that's wrapped around the core. The shaping is really good. This is a simple example of what Albion makes, but it's pretty well executed. It doesn't have any ripples and bumps, and all the transitions line up the way it's supposed to. And I can see the seam if I look close, but I can't feel it in any way. And this sword has been used quite a bit, and it hasn't flaked up, so it's held up quite well. So that would be a better example in my mind of a cable or a wrap. This is a much less expensive sword. This is a cold steel Italian arming sword, and I think it's about half the price of the Dark Sword Armory. So going from almost double to half, going the other way. Here, the shaping, it has some transition, but this is almost too sharp to be appropriate. I can feel where it indexes, but if I pinch really hard, it gets a little too thin on my hands. Transitions-wise, it's okay here, but here the pommel overlaps the leather. The leather also feels loose in such a way that if I twist my hands, if I grab it really hard and twist, it feels like the leather's going to rip. Also, muddiness, not particularly good. And so I would certainly argue that the Dark Sword Armory is far superior to this. It has some of the same kind of transitional muddiness that you might say on the risers, but the leather feels flimsy here, and it feels tight on the Dark Sword Armory. Here I can make out a big giant seam, and it feels like the leather's going to come off. I don't get that impression in any way on the newer DSA piece. Something relatively close in price point. This is a Ronin Euro War Sword number 2. It's a similar blade with a long running fuller, but different. It's a bit bigger. And it has a different choice in grip. It's got these larger cord wraps that wind around, but you can also see a seam here and similar issues, honestly, in terms of transition being good near the crossguard, but near the pommel, things get a little muddy. There's some ledges and odd transitions. So competition that's in a similar price point. I happen to like the shape of this grip. I think it's good, and I like the larger cord under here. I think it gives me more purchase, but at the same time, I think the Dark Sword Armory has more elegant execution in terms of the detailing that I'm seeing in the leather from the winding, as well as the seam not being stitched and being glued on. In terms of feel, it'd be tough to say which one I prefer. I think maybe I like the feel of the Ronin more, but the Dark Sword Armory, I believe, is easier to index. Anyway, those are a couple examples of different things. I thought it was just worth pointing out the contrast between Dark Sword Armory grips amongst maybe some of their peers in competition, but also just to show the evolution. It's cool to see over time a really old example in how things have improved over time. Nowadays, I certainly would prefer this grip by miles in contrast to some of the stuff that Dark Sword Armory used to do. And I certainly think that for the price point, they're doing a good balance of offering something that's elegant, good feeling, balances well in the hand, but obviously it comes with some caveats, and it's not as perfect as some of the stuff that is more expensive and some of their competition. Well, it's tough to say. Valiant Armory, I think, at the time did a better job on the grip, but now their stuff is not in the same price point, or at least it doesn't seem to be. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully the video has been interesting. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.